Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the very good fortune of directing our Environmental Change and Security Program Global Health Initiative here at the Wilson Center. On behalf of our President, Director, and CEO, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, want to welcome you here to the center. This enterprise today has been a close collaboration with our Africa program and Steve McDonald and Mamhadi and Derek and the whole crew. It has been a great learning experience for us that we look forward to sharing with you and putting this session together that we've entitled Nigeria Behind the Headlines, Population Health, Natural Resources, and Governance. And as you can see, we have adopted the kind of everything in the kitchen sink approach to titling today, and in fact, how we put together the agenda. And that's quite intentional. Intentional because one of our primary objectives at the Environmental Change and Security Program has been since we were founded in 1994 was to get different communities that are often working with their discrete portfolios, one might even say in their silos, whether they be disciplinary, bureaucratic, even out in the field at times, get those folks to have an opportunity to talk, to learn from one another. And there's an intuitive sense that these issues are connected. Sometimes we, particularly in the field, can see how they're closely connected. Oftentimes, however, how we organize our research, our programs, our funding streams, it pretends as if they're not. And so part of what we try to do at the Wilson Center as a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum is bring these different communities together, give them an opportunity, whether they be in research or practice, to learn from one another and make explicit our understandings of what we implicitly know are some of the connections between population health, development, natural resources, governance issues. And so in that sense, with this meeting, like so many at the center, we're not chasing the headlines and trying to keep up necessarily with today's event or today's crisis or today's great success, but instead to build a deeper understanding of the challenges as well as the opportunities in so many of these places around the world. We're very privileged to be focusing on Nigeria today. Again, kind of to give you a sense of the thinking behind this, this is now for our program, the fourth time we have done this with a specific country focus. We've done with our Asia program colleagues looking at Bangladesh and at Pakistan, with our Middle East colleagues looking at Yemen. And this year was we kind of moving westward there and working with our Africa program colleagues and looking at Nigeria. We do that with the longtime support and collaboration with USAID under our HELPS project, and specifically USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, and you're going to have an opportunity to hear from that office director. Scott Radloff directs that office. And I must say, again, you could say, well, we're covering a lot of issues, and that's a really specific one. But since literally 1996, this office has seen it as of interest and worthwhile to help facilitate discussions where issues beyond their immediate portfolio are discussed together with issues of demography, population dynamics, and better understand them. And so it really gets to the heart of what we're trying to do with, again, the kitchen sink approach, our HELPS project, Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security project. One word of housekeeping. We are webcasting today's event. What that really just means for us in the room is when we have our discussion periods, colleagues will bring you a microphone. And so if you can pose your question into the microphone so the folks online, both watching it live and then also the archive video, can hear that. We appreciate that. For those of you who are watching online, when presenters have PowerPoints, we hope to have those on the website so that it makes it easier for you to follow on, and frankly makes it much easier for our camera operators to not try to have the person speaking and the slides and back and forth. So finally, I will turn the floor over for some opening remarks, as I mentioned, from Scott Radloff, who is a sociologist with a focus on demography, has been a long-time leader at AID, most recently for quite a few years now, running the Office of Population and Reproductive Health look forward to his opening remarks and then on with the day's agenda. Scott, please, the floor is yours.
Is this on? Yep. Great. Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this event, which is very timely indeed. The latest headline, speaking of headlines, was the New York Times this weekend that was titled, Nigeria Tested by Rapid Rise in Population. I've been with USAID for almost 30 years now, and one of my first trips overseas was to Nigeria in 1984. And it was at a time when there was a fairly significant investment in family planning and maternal child health. And I think there was a lot of high expectations for progress. Nigeria, as everyone I think here knows, is the second largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa, following behind South Africa. Despite its resources and economic growth, its health indicators lag behind many poorer countries in the region. With a population of 162 million today, it is the region's largest country, comprising just under 1/5 of sub-Saharan Africa's population. And with 42% of the population under age 15, and with a population growth of 2.5% per year, continued population growth is assured, with a likely doubling of its population in as little as 30 years. In preparing for today's event, I look back on population and health projections made 30 years ago by the UN Population Division. And as many of you who work in this field know, it's a go-to source for a variety of population and health indicators and projections. So back in 1982, the UN Population Division estimated that the total fertility rate of Nigeria would fall from 6.8 to 4.7 by 2010. So over 30 years, a decline to 4.7. In fact, it fell only to 5.6, so not the progress that was expected. The UN also estimated at that time that Nigeria's infant mortality rate would fall from 132 to 57 deaths per 1,000 live births. In fact, it fell to just 97. I should provide a footnote that, by and large, these UN Population Division projections have been reasonably accurate. For every Nigeria that has fallen short of estimations, there's been a Thailand or a Bangladesh that has exceeded expectations. And it's extremely useful to look at those countries that have excelled for lessons. But for many countries, the UN population estimates holds up pretty well over 30 years. So 30 years ago, there was an expectation of better progress on demographic transition for Nigeria. The reasons for the lack of more significant progress are many, including political instability, fluctuations in economic progress, and inequities in health access. Donor support has also been erratic during these intervening years. USAID closed down most all of its support to Nigeria for about 10 years, beginning in the early 1990s. Other donors also left or ratcheted down their support during this period. Today, USAID and other donors are back in Nigeria. And for USAID, Nigeria is a priority country for many development programs, including many health programs. For family planning and maternal child health, Nigeria is one of 24 priority countries for USAID. We have seen our investments escalate over the past 10 years. But for family planning, there's been little to show for this investment. Modern contraceptive prevalence was measured in 2008 at just 10%, which is not very different from where it was 20 years ago, or 30 years ago for that matter. In nearly every other country that we've prioritized, we have seen significant progress in modern contraceptive use. Ethiopia went from 14% to 29% in just 6 years. Madagascar went from 18 to 29% in 5 years. Malawi from 28 to 42% in 6 years. Rwanda, remarkably, from 10% to 45% in 5 years. And we've also seen progress recently in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. There are reasons for hope. Nigeria last year held its first national conference on population issues in more than 30 years, a conference that was initiated by a revitalized NGO community. The government, for the first time, has allocated funding for contraceptives, $3 million this year, which is a start. The government also removed user fees that it used to charge women for contraceptives. This has resulted in more than a 5-fold increase in state-level requests for contraceptive supplies. Before the change in policy, the state-level requests totaled about 500,000, what we call CYP, couple years protection. Since that policy change, the state-level requests have grown to 2.8 million CYPs. I did a rough calculation of this. It translates to roughly, I believe, about a 5 percentage point increase in contraceptive use. So potentially contraceptive use has already risen in Nigeria from the 10% we saw in 2008 to 15% perhaps today. USAID and other donors, including and notably DFID and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, are increasing their support to Nigeria. While contraceptive use has been more or less static over the past 30 years, the unmet need for family planning, that is, women who do not want to become pregnant, either want to limit childbearing or to delay their next birth, and are not using an effective method, and so are exposed to unintended pregnancy, that unmet need has been increasing, measured at 21% in 2008. So the demand is there, and the question is, do we have the resolve to respond to that demand? I am very upbeat about the prospects for the future in expanding access to family planning services alongside other health interventions. As we know, family planning is a key intervention for maternal and child health and for family prosperity. And we know that family planning yields broader and long-lasting economic and development dividends as well. While there are many challenges faced by Nigeria, there's no reason that Nigeria cannot progress to the same degree as other countries in Africa. Commitment is key, and there are already signs that a renewed commitment is gathering in Nigeria. I look forward to today's seminar with the expectation that the challenges, opportunities, and the potential for health and development progress for Nigeria will be explored more deeply. So thank you to the presenters, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Scott. I think what we'll do now is a little move into chairs, and Scott and I will come down here so that we can see the presentations, and then Volker, you can also have a seat on the panel. And I'll turn the floor over to Jacob Adetunji, who's the lead technical officer in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at AID, to be our chair for the first morning panel.
Thank you. Yeah, as we have heard, Nigeria is a very demographically significant country in Africa. It's the largest country in the continent in terms of population. It's also the probably more than 50% of West Africa in terms of size. We begin today's deliberation by focusing on population trends. And so we have a set of 3 papers that will be looking at various aspects of population trends in the country. The first paper this morning will be presented by Bolatito Ogumboyi. Bolatito has over 6 years of experience in the non-profit sector in 4 sub-Saharan African countries. She's a population health specialist, and she holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and master's degree in public health from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. So she has worked across various parts of the continent, and she's currently a fellow at the Atlas fellow here in this area. So without much ado, I'll turn the floor over to Bola Tito.
Thank you, Jacob, for the introduction, and thanks, Kurt. That was a nice presentation on Nigeria. I'll be talking about population and demographic trends in Nigeria. As Kurt has said, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and is the 7th most populous in the world. Currently, the population of Nigeria is around 162 million. And yeah, in as much as we can think, wow, that's a lot, well, the population could actually be like the 4th in the world by the mid of the century, depending on what fertility trends are. So I'll be looking at projecting the population of Nigeria from 2010 to like 2050. So in Nigeria, well, we probably know there's rapid population growth, around 2.5% every year, and we have like 5 million Nigerians being added to the population every year. And depending on the population projection you look at, you have like 3 of them. You have the low, the medium, and then the high variant. And it's all about the fertility pattern of Nigeria. So looking at this graph, actually, Nigeria could actually be over 400 million in 2050, or also be maybe around a little bit over 300 million in 2050, depending on the fertility. And I must say that the difference in the fertility is not really like maybe 2 or 3 kids. Most of the time it's just slightly around 0.5. So this gives you an idea of where the population growth looks like in Nigeria. And I must say that of the 1.1 billion people that will be added to sub-Saharan Africa in 2050, 20% of them will be born in Nigeria. And you may want to ask, why do we have the rapid population growth in Nigeria? A look at the UN projection, looking at the population structure in Nigeria, shows that around 43% of Nigeria is below the 15 years. So this shows you like it has a very big base at the population, and also it's more like there's a big population at the base, and this also creates like what you call the population momentum. You can imagine these millions of people under 15 in the next 10, 20 years, they'll be entering into their reproductive age, and then you have even larger population in Nigeria. And also, why also you may think there is high fertility in Nigeria. Right now, the figure is around 5.7 children per woman. And that also varies depending on what part of the country you look at. Nigeria is a country, but it's also dynamic in that what happens in the north, or maybe the north central, is really different from what happens in the south. So you have like the northwestern part of the country having up to like 7.3 children being born to a woman, and then the southwestern part of the country about 4.5. But in totality, this figure is still high. I mean, in the 50s, the figures were around six children per woman, and we are in like 2012 now. It's really has not really even like reduced up to 1 child per woman. So the fertility are currently like high, and they've been high for the past 50 years. Now, so why, you may ask? Basically, there are 3 components of demographics in the country. What really make population to increase? Either they're like high birth or death or migration. In Nigeria, even though the fertility is high, you have the crude death rates is reducing over the year. You can see like in the 70s, like 21%, and it's going to reduce to like 7.7 in 2050. And fertility is still high, so you can just have like a picture of what would happen in the country. And also the childhood mortality, even though it's not as low as what USAID or some other people thought it would be by now, but it's reducing. the last DHS survey in Nigeria shows, well, not too much, but I mean, it's reducing over the years compared to the survey in 1993 till date. It's reducing. So you have fewer deaths, higher number of people being born in Nigeria. So that could tell you, yeah, the population is really, really increasing and is going to increase till, well, I don't know. Yeah, so, well, demographers will say there's what they call replacement fertility. And that's like when a woman is able to have like globally like 2.1 children in during our reproductive lifespan. So in Nigeria, this graph shows that even if Nigeria were to achieve a replacement fertility of 2.1 children per woman in 2020, then the population will like kind of stabilize around 300 million. Yeah, and then it won't grow again, just stabilize over the years. And if it were to achieve the replacement fertility in 2040 to stabilize around 400 million, and in 2080 to stabilize around 700 million. But I stand here to say that from the current UN projection, this is not likely to happen. Even with the low variant fertility, it won't happen earlier than 2070. And currently, well, it's more like Nigeria is kind of following the medium variant. So with the medium variant, this won't happen until like 2100. So definitely the population won't stabilize at anything less than 800 million. Yeah, and another thing, like Scott pointed out, is that though the fertility rate is high, what's causing this? Most Nigerian women are not using contraceptive. I mean, the last DHS shows that only about 10% of Nigerian women use modern contraceptive. That's like 1 out of every 10. So that explains why. And fine, most women, like the survey also showed, most women would love to use contraceptive, but they are not accessing it. Why? Maybe access, maybe commodities are not there, maybe the health facilities are not there. Different factors. It depends. I think it actually differs per woman. A lot of reasons. It could be cultural reason. It could be access. Yeah, but the fact still remain. The unmet need for family planning is still high in Nigeria. 20% is rather too high. Yeah, you may want to think about it. So why? What does this mean? What is the implication of this rapid population growth in Nigeria? What is the implication of Nigeria becoming the fourth most populous country, likely to become in 2050? Yeah, I would like to look at different areas or different issues why this population matters. Now, in Nigeria or elsewhere in the world, it's been known that high population density and urbanization actually drive infectious diseases. I mean, Nigeria has the second largest HIV-infected people in the world, only after South Africa, over 3 million people. Yeah, high population density and urbanization has been shown to increase the rate diseases, for example, tuberculosis, for example, spread in settings like Nigeria. And also, due to the large population base in Nigeria, there is often an overlap between countries with youthful population, high HIV prevalence, and lower sex family planning. Well, globally it's known that HIV is highest among youths between 15 to 24 years. And in Nigeria, these people constitute over 20% of the population. So you can imagine what makes Nigeria important is sometimes not really looking at the percentages, but when you look at what the absolute number that goes into the percentage, then it makes you really understand that a lot of people are being affected by these issues we're talking about. Yeah, and also a report done by World Bank, WHO, UNICEF, and UNFPA shows that there is often an overlap between countries that have high maternal mortality and high fertility rate. I mean, this graph shows you countries like Chad with over 1,200 women out of 100,000 live births dying. And then you see the fertility is way high, is slightly above 6 children per woman. And also you see Guinea-Bissau, you see Nigeria there too. It's really, really high. And when you look at these numbers and comparing it to like the numbers of women dying in Nigeria, it shows you that, yes, it's really something that is worrisome and something needs to be done. Yeah, so why do population matter to education, for example? I mean, research have shown that the smaller the family size, then the higher the likelihood for children to be educated, especially girls. In Nigeria, I mean, gender is really an issue. Educating girl child is really an issue. I mean, in most part of the country, around 20% of girls are married off before the age of 15. And research have shown that when girls stays in school, then the age that they get married is like higher, and then of course it reduces the number of children they will have over their reproductive lifespan. So also, needless to say, there's definitely a link between educational achievement and poverty. In Nigeria, households that are like in the highest wealth quantile are like less likely to experience poverty. And I must say that the poverty figures in Nigeria are quite high. Over 70% of Nigerian households live on less than $1 per day. And the last DHS shows that the more educated a woman is, then the less likely for her to have many children. I mean, women with over secondary or higher education, they have about 3 children less than those ones with no education. So to employment, why do Nigerian population, why does it matter to employment? The last national figure by the National Bureau of Statistics shows that the employment rate in Nigeria is around 23.9%. That's like quite high, and that's like it actually doubled over the last 5 years. And looking at previous figures, 2010, 2009, there's been an increase. And also, the survey also shows that the figures are higher. They are like highest for young population around 15 to 24. And also, there's also like a discrepancy among the people living in rural and the urban area. So there's actually high unemployment rate in the rural area compared to the urban area. I mean, this is worrisome because you may want to think about 70% of Nigerians are involved in agriculture. So and most of them are in the rural areas. So what could be happening, one may want to ask. But the figure shows over 14 million Nigerians are unemployed, and most of them are youth. So why do population matter to population economic growth, you may ask? I mean, countries like Scott mentioned, you look at countries that we should learn from, countries like Thailand. They've shown that there can be no economic growth without population coming down. This graph from data from World Bank and the UN population projection shows country like Thailand gaining, like increasing sporadically. In their GDP went up between 1980 and 1999. And when you look at it, this also coincides with the total fertility coming down. But for a country like Nigeria, you see, it's been not too good, but I mean, it's not really doing too fine when you look at the GDP. And the fertility still remains high. I mean, over the last 30 years, it has not really come down. So, yeah, this shows you that in talking about economic growth, one really needs to consider the population. And yes, why do population matter to migration and urbanization, you may ask? In Nigeria, a lot of people Nigerians are leaving the country than people coming into Nigeria. I mean, over 1 million Nigerians are in diaspora, they are abroad. And most of them, they are in Sudan and, of course, US, the UK. And you may want to think about it. International migration is an important issue. I mean, you have countries in Europe having reducing fertility over the years, and the working age is shrinking. Yeah, you could think about it. Maybe if Nigerians migrate, then they could make up maybe most of their working population. But it's something that is of international concern because such countries are like, okay, a lot of people, immigrants are coming in. What do we do about them? Their health style is different. The culture is different. So yeah, so population growth, rapid population growth in Nigeria does matter to migration. And talking about urbanization, some couple of years back, I mean, less than 40% of Nigerians live in urban areas. But right now we have like over around 49% of Nigerians living in the urban area. And this figure would actually increase to like 75% by 2050. Yeah, you may want to think about it. Wow, this is so much. But also, you look at it, how do people live in these cities? I mean, it's good. Urbanization is good because maybe it will allow, it's kind of make access to service easy for government to planning, but that is if the government is planning anyway. So you may want to look at it because in Nigeria, about 67% of Nigerians living in city actually live in what you call slums. I mean, these are like settlements where there's probably no sanitation, hygiene is almost zero. So you may want to look about it. This graph shows Africa and looking at the share of the population and looking at how many, the percentage of urban settlement that is being inhabited by people that living in the urban slums. You can see Nigeria. Nigeria is the one with the biggest circle there. I mean, it shows you like more than half. Like I said earlier on, over 60% live in urban slum. And I mean, the circle for Nigeria is so big because you look at that. This is in relation to the population, the number of people living in urban settlement itself. So yeah, I know later today we'll be talking about natural resources, environment. So why do population matters? Why does it matter to natural resources? I mean, high population growth increase demand for water. And in Nigeria, distribution of resources has always been a problem and it's been contextual over time. Well, according to an analysis done by Population Action International, looking at the number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that is likely to be faced by water scarcity or stress, that's like scarcity is defined by per capita scarcity is like the number of people in the population having access to like less than 1,000 cubic meter of water per capita. And scarcity is like between 1,000 and 1,667. Nigeria actually accounts for one of the 15 countries that will be experiencing this by 2025. And if the situation doesn't change by 2050, then Nigeria will move from being water stressed to being water scarce. And this is actually not even using the high variant population, just the medium variant population. And looking at the effects of climate change and with population growth, I mean, the situation could get worse in the future. So why does population matter to agricultural production and food security? I mean, food security is really an important issue in Nigeria. And also looking at the two major things we need to produce food, land and water. I mean, I just showed you, the previous slide shows that Nigeria will be experiencing, could be water stress or water scarce depending on the population growth pattern. So why does this matter to agricultural production or food security? This graph by Population Action International also shows that Nigeria is actually experiencing rapid projected decline in food production. And by this is like 2000, and this is like current figures, and this will definitely get worse by 2025 to 2050, depending on the fertility trend or the population growth pattern Nigeria decides to follow. So to climate change and resilience, another analysis done by Population Action International looked at four issues, looking at climate resilience, looking at high population growth, decline in agricultural production, and also looking at countries with high unmet need for family planning. So they actually classify these countries, and looking at this graph shows that Nigeria is actually experiencing all the three right now. It's experiencing rapid population growth, rapid decline in agricultural production, and also it has high unmet need for family planning by women. Yeah, to security and governance, I know most of you've seen Nigerians beyond the headlines. You've been saying, okay, Boko Haram, insecurity in Niger Delta and all that. Yeah, research have shown that population is always an underlying variable for conflict. And when you look at the population base in Nigeria, it acts a very big base. And looking at this projection, this pyramid, this is what the population of Nigeria would look like by 2050, following the medium variant. Even with this, it still shows like a large proportion of Nigeria will still be under the age of 30. Now, with the large youth bulge in Nigeria, most of them are like youth, they are unemployed. And don't forget that I said the unemployment figure in Nigeria is like around 24%. And this figures actually varies depending on what part of the country you live in. In some northern states in Nigeria, the figure is as high as 60%. So, for an unemployed youth, it's easier for the person to it's easier for you to tell the person, okay, come, I'll give you this so money, just come and just create little trouble for us. And the person will do it because he or she doesn't have means of surviving. So, it's easier, like they say, an idle hand is always the devil's workshop. So the old saying goes. Yeah, and also looking at international migration and population growth, there's a divide in Nigeria. You have cities like Lagos and Abuja growing every day, people leaving other towns or villages and wanting to be part of the wanting to take part of the economic opportunities in such countries. And also this creates kind of tension between settlers, original settlers and migrants, even within the Nigerian population. And also, a study done by a demographer shows that countries with youthful age structure, even when they achieve democracy, is less likely to be sustained. I think what is going on in Nigeria could point towards that. But anyway, I think there's hope in Nigeria anyway, because for the first time since Nigeria got our independence, we had a smooth civilian to civilian transition, and that was good. It was marred with a little bit of violence, but I think it's good. Yeah, it's not that bad after all. Yeah, so what does this mean for policy in Nigeria? I think I was part of a panel just 2 days ago, and our Minister for Economy and the one coordinating finance, Okonjo-Iweala, she said something like, yes, Nigeria has a youthful population, but it's not that bad. It's just all about planning. Even the demographers will tell you that depending on what you do to the youth and the population, that is what really matters. When you invest in this young population, it could actually drive economic growth in Nigeria. And what does it mean to invest in the youth? Education, jobs, infrastructure, healthcare, access to reproductive health services, which in Nigeria is still a challenge. And when you talk about education, it's not just all about school. Even the last education minister said something about Nigerians graduates not being employable because they are educated, but they don't have the skills. So the government and other friends of Nigeria should look at this. Population could be an asset for Nigeria, but you have to invest in the population. And also, in planning, national planning, even regional or local planning in Nigeria and foreign policy, you should not just plan blindly. Looking at this, the way the Nigerian population is, you should actually incorporate population dynamics happening in Nigeria into planning. And yes, Nigeria is currently facing, I know people would say maybe some of the challenges in Nigeria is basically because social services are not there. So improvement in social services is key. And lastly, I would like to say, depending on what you think, Nigerian population growth, it could be an opportunity and it could be a challenge, depending on what happens and what the government decides to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bolatito. Our next paper will be presented by Volker Trecho.
No, that's my bio.
That's okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. So Volker is lead economist in the office of the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. Has been in that position since 2010, December. From 2007, he was the lead economist for Nigeria. During this time, he published the book, Putting Nigeria to Work, a strategy for employment and growth. He led the first subnational development policy operation in sub-Saharan Africa in Lagos State, as well as the initial engagement with Niger Delta. Prior to 2007, Volker was at the International Monetary Fund, including as mission chief for Togo and resident representative in Albania. So today, the title of his paper is Employment in Nigeria.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction and for inviting me. Let me just start by saying that I think this conference is extremely timely because, as the previous speaker was just saying, the population growth is quite enormous in Nigeria, and the ranks of the unemployed seem to rise very quickly. And that is exactly the reason why, in my time when I lived in Nigeria in 2007 to 2010, we started working on this book that I recommend, which is called Putting Nigeria to Work, a strategy for employment and growth. And the main motivation for why we wrote this book is because there is a very important contradiction in Nigeria. One is that actually the economy is growing very fast. And I want to begin by talking about that, even though it doesn't really at this point speak directly to employment. The economy in Nigeria is growing very fast. It has been growing very fast even during the time of the world financial crisis in 2009, when non-oil growth was around 7.5%. And that economy is not driven by the oil economy, as is usually referred to. It is driven by the non-oil economy. In fact, the oil economy in my time was very heavily affected by the unrest in the Niger Delta, and we often had negative growth rates in the oil economy. We had positive growth in the non-oil economy, and that was not driven by what many people think is the banking sector or the telecommunication sector. They are tiny islands in Nigeria, the banking and the telecommunication sector. What has largely driven the non-oil economy was the other sectors: construction, wholesale retail, services, even manufacturing, to many people's surprise. And this theme is very much at odds with the other theme that is as real as which is unemployment. Unemployment is rising. So we tried to find what is it really that's behind this story. Why has growth been so fast? Why don't we see unemployment responding? And to begin all of this, we needed to overcome a very important challenge, which is actually find out what is employment in Nigeria. And what is employment in Nigeria is extremely difficult to find out because there is no reliable employment statistics. So the way we did this was by using two available surveys. One is the General Household Survey that is being done, and the previous speaker already mentioned it. That is done on an annual basis by the National Bureau of Statistics, and then the other one is the Nigeria Living Standard Measurement Survey, the annual SMS, which in our time was of 2003-2004. Now, the conference is not timely because actually this week is a very important week for data in Nigeria, because at the end of this very week, we are receiving the new data from the Nigeria Living Standard Measurement Survey. So this has been renewed now for the first time in 8 years. So this actually is the raw data that are going to show us whether major trends have shifted or not, actually going to become available by the end of this week. So what we did was we had to define the labor force. And we defined the labor force as those people that responded to those questions as worked for pay, got job but did not work, worked for profit, on attachment but did not work, did an apprenticeship or did nothing. And those that did nothing, that's the most important part, because depending on the response to why they did nothing, they were included as either as part of the labor force or not part of the labor force. Those that responded sick, looking for a job, believed no job was available, later 30 days or less, or waiting to begin work, were classified as those belonging to the labor force. Those that answered retired, invalid, or others were considered to be not part of the labor force. And those are then the results that we got. And that is itself already a very telling number, because only 74% of those in the age group 15 to 65 are considered to be part of the labor force. 26% are not in the labor force. That means many, and the vast majority of those 26% are those people that have stopped looking for work because they think that, they just, work is just not part of their universe. When we look down, and when you go to the book, Putting Nigeria to Work, we analyze this in greater depth. And when you look at what these 26% do, in the case, very often these are unmarried young girls that are staying at home and helping somewhat in the household. And as far as young men are concerned, these are people that have very often higher education. They have got some kind of degree, but they can't find a job. So they stay at home and do something there, hoping they will get a formal sector job that doesn't really exist. So that's a very important number. Now, among those, the official unemployment rate, and that's why it was actually confirmed, we had about 1.5%. And those are people that are involuntarily unemployed. These are people that actually are actively looking for a job right now, are on the market, but can't find a job. And that is the ILO definition of unemployment. That's why so often people, when they see those numbers coming from the NBS, they say this is wrong. It is not wrong, right? And this number of 3%, it corresponds to the ILO definition. The ILO definition considers unemployment to be involuntarily unemployed. Now, another very important factor that ties in with the previous presentation is the number of females that are outside of the labor force is twice as high as those of males, right? There is a huge discrepancy between females and males, right? And there are many reasons for that we don't have to go into right now. Now, then we looked at some of the major labor market trends in Nigeria since 1999. Now, the most surprising, the most shocking trend we found as an economist was that the number of formal sector jobs actually went down in Nigeria. And that was extremely surprising because if you look at the story since 1999, what people know is banking sector, telecommunication sector, entertainment industry, others. These are formal sector jobs. These are jobs where people go to work on a monthly basis. They collect a monthly paycheck, and those are the kind of jobs that actually have gone down. Now, why is that, right? The most important reason why those formal sector jobs came down is because civil service was reduced. The vast majority of formal sector jobs in Nigeria is civil service. Those jobs were reduced for various reasons. There was a huge overhang in 1999, and that, in order to put some kind of fiscal discipline into the system, you need to actually reduce that work. That is one of the main reasons. But the other one is privatization, right? Many state-run enterprises were actually privatized. And as they were privatized, they were shedding labor. This is some of the most important reasons. And those trends were not really compensated by these growing new industries. Telecommunications, they're very, very small. I mean, even if a bank grows by 100% every year, it may be going from 100 employees to 200 employees. It doesn't make a dent in a labor force that is about 70 million people like in Nigeria. So that formal sector jobs actually went down, the share. That's a very important trend. Now, the other one, what also went down, is non-agricultural self-employment, right? Those people, the urban people, right, that are sort of doing something. They are doing some kind of repair works, electricians. That share also went down a little bit. Now, the only area that actually went up is family agriculture. What you see, the big trend that we observed, and we have to wait whether that's going to be confirmed by the new NLSMS, is people actually going back to the rural areas and getting employed there. And that seems to be an important trend and the reason why people were doing this overall, in spite of a trend also the other way, which is from the rural to the urban, right, Abuja and Lagos. But by and large, an overall trend of going back to the villages is because food prices went up. Right? We had a tendency, agriculture has been doing relatively well. And because food prices actually went up and the incomes in the rural sectors actually improved somewhat. Now, and that is particularly the case for the young people. We found that between 1999 and 2006, right, among the young people, the share of family agriculture almost doubled. But at the same time, you have a massive increase in youth unemployment here. The share of the young people that are out of the labor force increased massively, right? And that contrasts, right, with a overall tendency. If you define this 26% as unemployment, it corresponds to the number that you gave, 23%. That number stayed broadly constant. So actually what we found is that for the country as a whole, but if you define unemployment as the combination of involuntary and voluntary unemployment, you're arriving at about a stable unemployment rate. And that it was through 2006. We have to now see whether that's going to be confirmed, because this is now fairly old. That means using the term jobless growth is not really appropriate, right? It is a growth that is broadly in line with the growth in the labor force. Growth in employment is broadly in line with the labor force. But the big problem with that is the youth unemployment, right? That's the number that we found through 2006. And that trend is really very much at variance in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries, right, where actually formal sector employment has been increasing in many countries. So again, to summarize, right, the major structural change that we found in Nigeria's labor force is a shift into agricultural employment and a shift out of wage employment. And the vast majority of those wage jobs in the public sector and even NGOs and national organizations, we found that only 2% of the labor force is employed in formal private sector jobs. That is a number that is tiny compared to what other African countries have. We have Ghana like 10%, or even other countries, Tanzania, 15, 20%. And in the book, we go into what kind of strategy Nigeria could pursue to increase that. Right. The other thing that's very shocking as well is that there is a decline. With the decline in the number of wage jobs, the return on education has been falling. Right. And that means people accumulate more and more degrees. Right. In order to get these small numbers of formal sector jobs, they keep going back to school and add another bachelor's degree, another master's degree, hoping that by doing so, they will get their hands on one of these formal sector jobs in the banking industry, in the telecommunications industry, and some of these other industries. And that's so difficult. Right, because those jobs just don't keep growing at the pace that it is necessary. So, but there is also a positive story here. We looked at incomes, and one of the income numbers we found there was family agriculture. Right, family agriculture has been rising very much. The income there, corresponding to. And the story, the economics behind this is that Nigeria has a lot of inflows of capital, right? Both remittances, foreign direct investment. With the onset of democracy, people come back. So aggregate demand in the economy has been growing very fast. Consumption has been growing very fast. And primarily this was affecting food. And as a result, food prices actually went up. And that made agriculture more profitable, right? And as a result, actually, incomes in those rural communities seem to have increased, right? So that's, and we believe actually that extreme poverty may have declined. Now that needs to again be confirmed. Of course, there was the recent publication by the National Bureau of Statistics that showed that poverty had increased in Nigeria. We believe there are some methodological issues with those numbers. So that needs to be still confirmed. Now, let me come to another issue, which is we looked at the whole issue of the skills, right? And the problem, of course, with the young people is that they don't really have the kind of skills that are needed for the labor market, right? So we looked at the various modes of skills acquisition that are relevant for the informal sector, and we looked also at policies that could be used in order to become more effective there, right? And now one of the things we find is that there's really a bias against vocational training in Nigeria, right? The vocational training is almost non-existent. And that has a very major problem, right? And the government strategies for skills development are really, there is no consistent strategy there, right? There's either response to a crisis or temporary social measures to tackle unemployment. And many of these existing programs in vocational education, they lack appropriate funding and so on. So there is really, the vocational training needs to be based also on more accurate labor market information. Right, there needs to be better quality insurance, and there's also really no mechanism right now for recognizing those skills that are acquired in the informal sector. One of the most important ways in which people acquire skills is through the informal apprenticeship system and the traditional apprenticeship system. There are millions of Nigerians that are working in this area, and there's really no structure for this at all, even though one could relatively easily put a structure in there and make it more formal and give it more of a recognition. So we came up with a number of recommendations to put more emphasis on the vocational system, and we worked with this with some of these institutions, like, for example, in Kaduna, the NBTE, right, the Nigeria Board of Technical Education, which was working on a very important project called the IEIs, right, the Innovative Enterprise Institutions, right. That is, it would be a breakthrough if it really was implemented. I don't know whether it is now being implemented. So we had a lot of exchanges on these things, like putting a national vocational qualifications framework and so on in place, right? That's all. These are things that would be very important in order to address the supply side of the equation, because obviously as Nigeria faces this huge population growth, right, it needs to also qualify its labor force. At the same time, the demand side is so important as well. And one comment on the previous thing with the declining food production, right? That of course assumes that productivity will not improve, right? Nigeria's agriculture is extremely has very, very low productivity, and there are enormous efforts right now underway, right, to commercialize agriculture, right? Nigeria could have a vastly expanding food production, even with the water stress, right? Even with the water stress, if there was a little bit of an effort more to put more productivity growth. And overall, we believe that Nigeria could even grow at double-digit rates if there was more of the on the side of the business constraints, right? Like power and other things that could be happening as well. So I think overall, I think that if the government really decides to do a lot of things, right, and improve the situation, a country that has been growing by 7-8% on an annual basis with almost no power, right, could easily grow, much faster, and then also we will have a much better fix on all these employment problems that I was talking about. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Troy.
Tony.
Tony, sorry.
Troy, my father was from Troy.
Oh, it's Troy. Okay, yeah, sorry. So, sorry, he gave me a separate bio to read. Okay.
It's just my handwriting. That's
okay. That's fine. So, Tony is a lawyer and a business advisor with over 30 years of experience in Africa. He is vice president of Manchester Trade LID. Limited, okay. And adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies, and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was a lecturer at Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria for some years.
Not for some years, for 3 months.
For 3 months, okay.
It seemed like some years.
Seemed like some years. Okay, so I think I'll limit my chances for error. I turn the floor over to him.
Thank you very much, and appreciate Jeff and Steve for inviting me here today for this wonderful panel. And a robust panel as it is, we have some experts in Nigeria with much deeper and greater knowledge than myself. Carl Levan, who's just published a book on Nigeria, is here. Peter Lewis, the Dean of the African Studies Program at SAIS, and I think we've all learned from Pauline Baker over the years many, many times on how to understand Nigeria. Professor Allen in the back. We have some real expertise here in Nigeria, and I'm delighted to be here. And Volker, I remember the first time that I walked into the IFC offices in Abuja when I was conducting a study, which you probably read, for prospects of non-petroleum investment in the Nigerian economy in 1999 to 2001. We went into the IFC offices in Abuja, and the country director said, well, if you really need to get down and get to the real hard data in this country, you really have to dig, and you really have to go beyond just the sort of the front door. And he said, I learned this from my driver. He said, I'd been in Nigeria for about 6 months, and I just was being frustrated because I just kept getting no told to me by everybody that I tried to get information from. And the driver pulled him aside and he said, look, Mr. So-and-so, you're a very polite and respectful man, but the problem is in Nigeria, to really get anything done, you've really got to show some kafi. And he said that if you really want to get into the details and get information from people, you really have to sort of get through the door and try to really demonstrate your ability to work hard and get information. So, Volker, thank you for your presentation. The quality of your data is fabulous, and I look forward to seeing more about it. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the prospects of Nigeria's economy in the non-petroleum sector, looking specifically at sets of business opportunities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the wonderful data that we've seen here. I'll repeat some of it going forward, but I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the story on agriculture and the story on manufacturing. And then I'm going to put together a brief discussion of a few points where I think we're going to see some great growth in the Nigerian economy going forward, and some of the challenges that will make that happen. Talk a little bit about the Nigerian economy, a little bit of an overview, agriculture, manufacturing, making sense of Nigeria from an investment and business standpoint, and then some conclusions. I think we all seen from the previous presentations where Nigeria is and roughly what its population is. We talk a little bit about the impressive GDP growth that Nigeria has achieved. Currently, the per capita income is $2,600 in some data. The minister who was here earlier in this week seemed to suggest that that data was a little bit lower. Growth rate of 6.9%. Again, that might be a few points lower from her presentation earlier in the week. And we've seen unemployment rates 21%. Well, that's quite a bit lower than what we've seen earlier. One of the challenges that we've seen in Nigeria in recent weeks is studies demonstrating that while there is impressive GDP growth, if we can see in the lower graph here, that growth is not being distributed evenly through the economy. In fact, we're starting to see the Gini coefficients in Nigeria from an income measurement distribution standpoint getting more adverse, that there's more concentration of wealth, that there is actually increasing poverty in Nigeria. So while there is growth, the growth is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And that, of course, I think portends ill for many of the political scenarios going forward. We talked a little bit about the distribution in the economy, agriculture, which has seen some impressive growth, as Volker said, services, which include banking, telecom, and industry, which includes consumer goods and manufacturing. Export commodities, 95% of what Nigeria exports is in the petroleum area. Small percentages of cocoa, rubber are also exported. Import commodities, machinery, chemicals, transportation equipment, manufactured goods, food, of live and processed. We see the export economy, Nigeria's balance, if payments, if you would, export 101 billion, imports of 67 billion. Significant growth in non-oil exports we've seen, as Volker's pointed out in his presentations, and this is in Naira billions, so you would divide that by 150. We've seen impressive growth in Nigerian exports in agriculture, and in also impressive growth in non-agricultural exports as well. But as Volker said, Nigeria unfortunately has among the lowest yields in all of the world in terms of agricultural productivity. Over the course of a period of 1961 to 2008, Nigeria has in effect seen among the lowest rates of crop yields in the world compared to Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Brazil. I'd like to talk a little bit about the textile industry because I think it's a mirror of some of the problems of Nigeria's manufacturing over the past several years. I know a little bit about, actually I know quite a bit about the textile industry in Nigeria over the years because I've been a longtime advisor to the United Nigerian Textiles Limited, UNTL, which as many of you know in this audience, some of you are wearing maybe some of their garment or their fabrics, was the largest manufacturer of textiles in Nigeria and in West Africa, at one point having 40,000 employees manufacturing the beautiful wax and brocades and so forth that are consumed in Nigeria. So I've had the opportunity to study that industry in great depth, and the industry has been in a state of utter decline since 2000. In the 2000s, over 100,000 jobs were lost, and their loss has been much to the benefit of Chinese imports, which have replaced those domestically manufactured products. As you can see, the export of wax prints, which is the main stock and trade of the Nigerian textile industry, have increased dramatically from China. And what has unfortunately happened is that many of those products are mislabeled and misdescribed as being Nigerian products, when in effect, many of you know, and the market women know as well, that these products are actually coming from China and often use fake identification to suggest to the consumer that they are products from Nigeria. This is a story that we've heard over and over again, and just to point a couple of the highlight data here, that Nigerian employment in the textile sector at one point in 1985, roughly about the time when I started going to Nigeria, was 250,000. By 2008, that has fallen to 40,000. Nigeria used to be the second or third largest producer of cotton in Africa, and 70% of that cotton in Nigeria, unlike the other cotton producers, was consumed locally. So unlike Mali or Burkina Faso or even Sudan, which were larger cotton producers, all that cotton was exported largely to France or the UK and then sent elsewhere for manufacturing. Nigeria, unlike any of the other countries, large cotton producers, transformed its cotton into fabric. And that was a terrific boon to employment, because what we found is that for every one manufacturing job, now I'm talking about textiles, not apparel. Apparel, cut and sew, this is a smaller activity, but industrial production to produce manufactured textiles is fairly industrial. So every job that we had in the industrial production related to about 10 jobs in the Nigerian economy, from the production of cotton to the growing, to the spinning of cotton, to the weaving, to the picking and cleaning, to the post-manufacturing, women making up the garments in the stores, the retail trade, and so forth. So we found that there was an enormous knock-on effect, both backward and forward linkages to the production of fabric. And when the industrial, so each of these 250,000 or 210,000 jobs represented a number of perhaps 2 million jobs that were related to that industry. Now, there are unfortunately, many patrons or factors that contributed to this collapse of the manufacturing sector and the collapse of the cotton-producing sector, which included, much of the, unfortunately, the cotton boards, which collapsed because of rent-seeking corruption. Then again, the World Bank came in and their structural adjustment programs and said, look, we're going to have to dismantle these infrastructures of cotton purchasing agreements. And, the industry collapsed. I don't know when the cotton industry will be back in Nigeria, but there are other areas in agriculture that are showing some promise. I talked a little bit about, this is from another presentation, about the various ways in which the imports purloin the intellectual property of Nigerian and trademarks of Nigerian producers, but that's perhaps not something that we need to dwell upon here today. We talked a little bit about enormous consumer growth in Nigeria and growing both in agriculture and in manufacturing and services. What are some of the impediments of that development? Lack of land, and particularly in agriculture, lack of land of commercial agriculture. We've got small scale, but one of the things that we featured on in my World Bank study is the issues pertaining to land ownership in Nigeria is still very much problematic, and still many of the reforms for land are stalled at the National Assembly. So we really need to see more aggressive or ambitious land reform. Weak supply chains in the agricultural, particularly post-harvest storage, is very, very weak in Nigeria. We looked at the onions in Sokoto for a client of mine, looking at trying to develop better storage systems for the vast productions of red onions in the northwest of Nigeria, and about 60% of that crop is lost before it's delivered to market. So we have terrible problems with post-harvest loss. Lack of infrastructure, which includes power, water, some of these issues that were discussed earlier. Lack of regulatory consistency across the board, not only as it pertains to land reform, but as it pertains to just the financial services sector. Political culture, rent-seeking in Nigeria still tends to be at the extreme, and a great impediment to Nigeria's economic growth, which includes governments and corruption. But let's talk a little bit about opportunities. It's not all bad news. I think there's enormous opportunities in Nigeria. It's a country of great promise, and unlike Brazil, Brazil used to be mentioned as in the same vein 20 years ago. It's a country of great promise and will remain a country of great promise until they really make some hard decisions on their own internal governance. I think Nigeria could follow a path very similar to Brazil. There are many commonalities, not only the Yoruba culture, which the Brazilians inherited from you. First of all, in physical infrastructure, the sort of public infrastructure side, roads and rails, water and sanitation, power in its production, transmission, and distribution, and ports. Surprisingly, Chief Ngozi just the other day said that the second most listed impediment to commerce in Nigeria is the port system. Port system requires not only investment in physical infrastructure, but administrative infrastructure. Goods in the ports in Nigeria are among the highest prices in the world. Clearance is over 3 weeks average in Nigeria for goods to get through customs. And that's just a series of rent-seeking opportunities. In our study for the World Bank, we made a discussion on the Nigeria Customs Service, and our conclusion was that there are 16,000 customs agents in Nigeria, and all of them live on a sort of hand-to-mouth basis of how much money they can squeeze out of the importers. So it really is a system that was vastly corrupted and needs improvement. I think the areas that I mentioned, roads, rails, water, sanitation, power, and ports, require a certain amount of public investment. We've seen that a little bit in the discussion earlier. That is going to require a big change in political commitment and unfortunately, a deeper social contract between the governed and the governing in Nigeria, which has been lacking. I think people are willing to invest in public infrastructure and wait it out if they honestly feel that there's going to be something coming at the end. Unfortunately, Nigeria's history has not given people confidence for that. Real property, though, in the commercial sense, not the public infrastructure sense. Housing. Chief Ngozi said not recently, or when she was at the World Bank, she used to say that Nigeria is 13 million housing units short. So there's vast opportunities for public housing. In commercial real estate, whether it be in large cities, but even in secondary cities. And I notice that in places like Ilorin, where you really see the need for investment in commercial real estate, the secondary cities, where we're going to see a lot of urban growth. Oil and gas, the petroleum industry bill has been held up and is unlikely to pass through this current legislature. I think we're going to see the reworking of the petroleum bill in the next legislative session. I think it's going to open up, I hope, if it gets passed, a whole growth in the oil and gas sector. Right now, Nigeria gets about $1 to $2 billion a year of new investment in the petroleum space. Yesterday, the CEO of Shell Nigeria at the Corporate Council in Africa said that they need about $10 billion a year for investment in oil and gas, particularly in deep water offshore, to achieve Nigeria's full production. Shell in itself has $14 billion of investment waiting to be made in deep water Nigeria once the passage of the petroleum bill happens. In agriculture, you have an absolutely wonderful Minister of Agriculture. Minister Adesina came and presented here in Washington about 3 weeks ago. He is truly a remarkable, one of the most informed and impressive spokesmen on Nigeria that I've ever encountered. He talked about the growth of the agricultural sector, which Volker mentioned earlier. He predicts by 2020 to 2025, the sector will grow from its current state of $95 billion a year to $259 billion a year. The commodities where we're going to see the greatest amount of growth include rice, cocoa, palm, cassava, rubber, and protein, chicken, fish, meat, whatever that is vastly undersupplied in Nigeria. And of course, that will also present great opportunities in storage and processing. Health. We talk a little bit about the growth of public health, but we also shouldn't look aside the opportunities in private health. One of the groups that I've done some work with, Hygeia, which is a health maintenance HMO, Professor Alibute, which you probably know, he and his daughter have made great strides in the development of private health in Nigeria. I think there's opportunities in chronic diseases such as diabetes. It's a big growth in Nigeria. We're talking about cardiac interventions. We're talking about the growth of the infrastructure necessary for private health, including path labs, dialysis centers, and so forth. Manufacturing, construction materials, looking at Nigeria imports its building supplies, its bricks and its roof tiles from Spain and Brazil. I mean, how does that make any sense? I mean, Nigeria is going to grow with power supply. It has ample supply of building materials such as for cement, for ceramics. That will grow. I think you're going to see continued growth in consumer goods. ShopRite is building, ShopRite CEO, Whitey Basson, says to me that their plan right now is to build a new ShopRite every quarter indefinitely in Nigeria, in the secondary cities. Nigeria is a huge consumer opportunity, and ShopRite is the company that's really invested heavily into growing this space. I think in the consumer goods, that includes everything from agriculture to diapers. I think there's enormous opportunities there, not only for the internal market, but also for the regional market. And then in services, Volker didn't make mention of a point that I find just astounding. There has been a great improvement in banking in Nigeria. I think the governor is also a remarkable man, Governor Sanusi, and he's made some tough decisions on reforming the banking sector. And the 24 banks that we have now are a lot better than they were 5-10 years ago. For my personally self, getting tripped up in the Savannah Bank scandal, if you remember that, some years ago. But the fact is that between 70% and 80% of Nigerians are still unbanked. I mean, there's still a vast underbanking in Nigeria. And the fact that the velocity of money is still very slow in Nigeria compared to Kenya, where they now use IT and M-Pesa, the velocity of money is much more rapid in Kenya than it is in Nigeria. A lot of improvements need to be made in the banking, and there's still a basic mistrust in banking in Nigeria among consumers because banks have basically been used to service the interest of the rich and the entitled and not to really provide services to the poor. So people still stuff money in their mattresses, and that's a culture that's going to have to change. Lastly, and we talked a little bit about this labor surplus issue. Jean-Michel Severino, who's a well-known and respected author in France who worked with Volcker at the World Bank and has written a widely reviewed book that came out in the Wall Street Journal review this week about Africa's moment. And, Jean-Michel's a fascinating guy who thinks beyond, sort of outside the box on a lot of issues, and I think this is one of his great contributions about Africa's labor surplus. If you remember Professor Lewis talking in the early stages about economics and the labor surplus issues and strategies. The issue is, how does Africa harness that labor surplus? Professor Ngozi said 10% of Nigeria's GDP is from remittances, and in other economies it's probably even higher. I think that the issues pertaining to getting labor mobility to where it's needed in Europe, in Asia, in America, is still going to be a big problem, and it's going to be a sticking points because of the issues that you mentioned earlier about culture and fears and suspicions. But where I think Nigeria's labor surplus can be to its great advantage, if they make these investments in public infrastructure and business facilitation and regulatory common sense and invest in their people, then I think Nigeria will take advantage of this labor surplus and become itself an opportunity for investment in manufacturing. And I'll just close with this slide to quote Chief Ngozi: Nigeria is too important a country to be defined by its problems, and I really believe in that. What will be required is political consistency and political leadership, the development of the capacity of the state, which we all know is very weak, practical business-friendly regulation, and a long-term commitment to its youth for employment. If they can achieve this, I think Nigeria will be at a takeoff point. I hope I live long enough to see Nigeria achieve the success that we've seen in Brazil in just the last 5 or 7 years. I think it can happen. I think it's a great country. I find Nigerians motivated, creative, hardworking people, and I just hope that future you'll be able to capture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've now listened to 3 very important papers on various aspects of population, economy in Nigeria. We have about 30 minutes during which we'll have opportunities to make comments and to ask questions. The process is as follows. There will be 2 microphones around the room. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, it will be necessary for you to raise up your hand, and before you ask your question, please identify who you are and your affiliation. So I think we'll open the floor now.
Carlos Manuel Indagochea, the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. I wanted to ask, what is the degree of commitment and especially national consensus in Nigeria about reproductive health and family planning policies, especially given the religious pluralism and the various religious obstacles that may or may not exist?
So the question is about the commitment of Nigerian government to family planning, given the diversity of religious affiliations and competing interests within the country. So, no, Blatito, do you want to try, or you want me to begin?
I was hoping we just take the questions and then.
Okay. Okay, and another question. So we can accumulate about 2 questions or 3 questions, and then we turn the panel. Or more than 3. Okay.
Hi, I'm Carl Levan from American University. And I have lots of questions in my mind, but I want to ask about two things, land reform and also this question of inequality. And I know that the next panel will address governance issues, of course, but my basic question is, given the problem that current land law presents, what does the private sector want to see done? I mean, the National Assembly a few years ago upheld some of the worst provisions of the Land Use Act from the 1970s. And so what should be done about that, and how, what sort of political measures is the private sector willing to support? And same goes for the inequality question. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the debates on NAFTA 20 years ago, where people in the United States were pointing out no one's going to be able to buy your exports if wages don't go up. So who's going to be shopping in ShopRite if inequality isn't addressed?
Dr. Fisherton.
Thank you, sir. I really have two questions. My name is Bamikale Fisherton from the E2L project. And the first question relates to VOCA on talking about the labor force in Nigeria. Looking at the 2003-2004 data that you presented, I just wanted to know from you how relevant do you think this data is, considering the situation today in Nigeria in terms of employment and underemployment? And maybe if you can give us more information about the destruction of the data that, the nature of the data you use, how it was collected, where it was collected, because it's talking about 74% of Nigeria now in labor force. I'm a little bit concerned. This is 2003 data. And considering what has happened between 2003 and now, how representative of the situation in Nigeria do you think this data is? And to Bola Tito, that was a great presentation, and I just really love the differential that you were able to show with respect to the CPR in Nigeria. One of the papers that we presented, I think a couple of years ago, was really looking at the constraining factors to family planning use in Nigeria. And one of the things we thought about really was the political considerations. Most of the time we think people really have the mindset of their own, that they can control some of the things they do. But there are a lot of influences over the way we think. The environment in which you live really determines your level of horizon, the kind of things you really aspire to in life. When you talk about poverty, if people live among other poor people, I don't think really bother about being rich, because really that environment determines their horizon. What exactly do you think we can do? Because again, when you look at the geographic differentials in fertility and something, it has to do with really the level of economic development. It has to do with the fact that really people are living in an environment where they are not motivated really to get out, to do something new. How do we change that mindset wherein people really see numbers as a way of controlling wealth? Because those who will make it among them really don't stay in that environment. The moment they make it, they get out. So how do you think we can change the mindset of people really to see the benefit of really using modern contraceptives and limiting their fertility?
Thank you. Maybe we'll take just one more, and then we'll ask the panelists to speak. Yes, the man in yellow tie in the middle there, sorry.
Thanks. Peter Lewis, SICE. Volker, these numbers are very interesting, and the methodology applied, a more rigorous and careful methodology using ILO approaches, is much appreciated. I'd like to focus on your final slide and ask a little more detail about the takeaway. The broad popular perception and the anecdotal story is that poverty and unemployment are of enormous proportions in Nigeria. Afrobarometer asks people, largely in line with U.S. Labor Department questions, are you currently employed? Are you looking? And Afrobarometer usually gets a number in line with about 24 to 28% unemployment. You're suggesting that the number is actually 2% and that the economy is growing in excess of 7% in non-oil sectors, which is obviously a much more encouraging story. And yet we have a good deal of evidence of high levels of urbanization, even though your numbers suggest that people are moving into agriculture and discouraging poverty numbers. So I'd like to make sense of this a little bit and just ask, if people are moving into agriculture and if people are working in the informal sector, and if only, if I got it right, 2% of the labor force is in private formal sector employment, where are the opportunities for expanding livelihoods and improving employment? What should the policy takeaway be?
Thank you. I think I will ask the panelists to respond to the four, including maybe 6 different types of questions from 4 people.
Okay. I'll start with the first question on the government commitment to family planning, given the religious diversity in Nigeria. Well, like Scott rightly mentioned, I mean, the governments of Nigeria, they've really been trying over the couple of years. I mean, just last year, they actually removed the user fee associated with access to contraceptives in Nigeria. And yeah, the government worked with organizations like USAID, UNFPA, trying to assess that. But I think, yeah, they are doing fine. There's really not like a neglect, but I mean, more could be done. And I think for me, what is really associated with the success story recorded in countries like Rwanda is the fact that access was actually increased. I mean, family planning, contraceptives were actually demedicalized. And I think Nigeria could actually take a clue from that. Most of the time, we always look at government facilities. But one thing I've realized, I mean, like, in growing up in a city close to Lagos, is that sometimes it's not always everybody that goes to the government facility. I think government also need to look at the opportunity in the private health sector in trying to expand access to family planning. And yeah, looking at the family planning issues in Nigeria, what is also important for us to know is that given the last DHS, the number of children being desired by women is still high in Nigeria. I think it's, apart from being a religious thing, it's also a cultural thing. I mean, someone like my father, who is educated, would tell my siblings, I had 5 of you, so you should have 5 too. And I'm like, what for? He's like, oh, you should have 5 so that, we can be come have family unions. I'm like, okay, good, that's wonderful. So who takes care of them? I'm like, things have really changed, I think the lesser we are, the more opportunities for us. And I look at someone like me, I think maybe if we were 10 in my family, maybe I wouldn't be here. So I think people, it's not, apart from the government being committed to addressing this issue also, like Dr. Fayechiton rightly said, I think we need to work on our mentality also. And how do we do this? I think what is important is we cannot set aside education. I mean, growing up right from primary school, there should be sexuality education incorporated into it. I know people have talked about youth issues, adolescent access, but sometimes I look at it that those things that they don't really go beyond maybe 1 or 2 government hospitals or maybe 1 or 2 centers in Lagos or Ibadan or some other places. But I think there's really opportunity in Nigeria that people are not, the government itself is not really harnessing. And yeah, I think really the government is trying, but they can definitely do better. I don't know if Dr. Jacob wants to answer, address that also.
No, let's keep going. So,
okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Walter, you go ahead.
Okay. How do I press this on here?
Yes, it's on.
It's on. It's already on. Yeah. Let me just start with a question on the unemployment rates. There may have been a misunderstanding. We think my study finds it is about 26, 27%, because it is the sum of involuntary and voluntary unemployment. ILO definition only refers to involuntary unemployment. That means people that actually are actively looking for work but cannot find one. The far more relevant number in a country like Nigeria to measure unemployment is the voluntary unemployment. That means people that have just basically forgotten about work paid employment because they think there is nothing out there for them, right? And that's the number that is out of the labor force. That's the 26% that you saw. And that corresponds to your findings as well, and also to the other question. The numbers are coming up by the National Bureau of Statistics in Abuja. And they, as was already mentioned, every year there is the General Household Survey. And then every so often there is this Nigeria Living Standard Measurement Survey, right? And the strength, I think, because it was so important to cross-check those figures to come to good conclusions, we actually compare systematically, right, the Nigeria Living Standard Measurement Survey with what the General Household Survey says, right? So to have two different sources that also use somewhat different methodologies and to sort of contrast the figures, and the conclusions are broadly similar between the two of them. So just to say again, I think in our view, unemployment in Nigeria is close to 1/3 of the population that would like to work. Then coming to the question of the inequality, that's of course a very interesting one. Nigeria's growth has been primarily driven by consumption, right, in the past, the nominal growth, and that's coming from outside, right? It's coming from remittances, coming from foreign direct investment. It does not come really from the fact that Nigeria is upgrading to higher value-added production, and thereby, like the East Asian model, it's one that's where a lot of money is coming in, also from the oil sector somehow that's trickling down the system, and then leads to increased consumption. There is a lot of evidence of an emerging middle class, and I think this person from ShopRite that the speaker was mentioning, right, who says every quarter another store of ShopRite, he feels that in those numbers. When he looks at his sales figures, there is an emerging middle class in Nigeria, right? And then you see that everywhere, right? And that it's coming from various sources, that middle class, right? Those three factors of capital inflows, right? Remittances, foreign direct investment, and money from oil, right? That is somehow trickling down, is creating growing consumption. And there may be indication that inequality is declining a little bit. From, of course, situation where Nigeria was before, right, is vast inequality, but with the emerging middle class, there may be, and plus with some possibility that extreme rural poverty may be declining a little bit. It could be possible that inequality at least is not deteriorating from its very high level that it already has.
I'll just comment on the inequality. Yes and no. I mean, I think the Nigerian middle class is growing. I do think that the rising tide is lifting all boats, but I think it's sort of like this. I think that there is maybe a perception that there is a growing middle class and that many people lot in life is better, but I still think that there is a more general perception that was cited in these recent studies that the super wealthy still concentrate have an enormous amount of control over the economy. And that is still, I think, a threat. However, in the times of 20 years ago in Brazil, we were saying the same thing about the Gini coefficient in Brazil being so dramatic that you had great concentrations of wealth in Ipanema and Sao Paulo and compared to the favelas. Now, Nigeria still has favelas, but it also has 30 or 40 million people that have really attained middle-class status that didn't. So I think that you might liken it to Nigeria. What happened? What was the difference? Well, Brazil sort of got its leadership model straight. If you take a look at the Cardoso, Lula era of Brazilian leadership, there was policy consistency. There was a recognition that the state could work for the people. I think that they made some common sense regulatory reforms to open up their economy. If you remember the sort of walling off of Brazil from exports and IPR conflicts and so forth, they got over that. So that there was intelligent reform, a commitment to consistency and leadership, and I think people started to reinvest in Brazil. Brazil and Nigeria had a lot in common. Yes. Anybody had any money, they took it out. Go to Paris or Miami or what have you, and it was filled with wealthy Brazilians. Brazilians decided, and that you would talk to them about this endlessly, to invest in their own country. And I think Nigerians have not yet gotten to that point, but they're getting there. And I think that'll make a big, big help. Land reform, Carl. I think what land developers hate are black boxes, things that you just don't understand the process. The way that Nigerian military rule governed in the provinces was to cede indirect control over land to the military governors, right? Because they couldn't stay on top of everything. They had to basically appoint their indirect leaders to control land issues. So any land transaction had to go through governor's approval, military governors or otherwise. That system is still largely in place. And the problem is that the investors just don't know how to navigate a black box. You don't know how long your lease is. You know, you might get title to a property, but you decide the guy where you need an easement from next door, land is controlled by the governor's brother, and he's not going to give you that easement that you need to make that property worthwhile. That type of stuff really is still an impediment. But having said all of that, Ghana is still a mess in terms of land issues. The land in Ghana is still mired in the issue of inheritance in different tribal structures, as some of those of you who know Ghana well. And yet I was in Ghana 3 weeks ago, and the place is booming. I mean, you know, even though they haven't gotten the land reform issue right and they're still wrestling with it, they find ways around it. So I don't think it's necessarily an insurmountable hurdle, but I do think it's going to make things a lot easier if they can confront head-on some of these issues pertaining to land reform.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes. I will ask for another round of questions. Yes, sir, the man in black.
Mohyuddin Haider, University of Maryland School of Public Health. Actually, I wish our friend from World Bank could be here.
Okay. His drum roll. I mean, what? And through door number 3.
No, I am not an economist. What you presented in your model, it is interesting, and also it is confusing. I could be your student later. One thing is that health has become part of economic security. No controversy about that. And in your presentations, given your economic model, I wish you could explain a little bit more. What does it mean to the health status in Nigeria? Because all the donors have been trying to pursue Nigerian government to allocate more money for health sector, including Defense Department. Now, if the World Bank doesn't show that how health interacts with economic growth, Ministry of Planning will not listen. And World Bank plays an overall role in the multi-sectoral economic growth in Nigeria. And if that can be explained a little better, it could be helpful for other sectors like public health.
Okay. Thank you. So we have another question at the back. Man.
Thank you. Abdullah Babikir from Sudanese Workers. Just I have a question. How many organizations or like small societies or cooperative societies working with small business or like handicraft business in Nigeria? I don't know. Have any map or any amount this organization helps the people in employee or make training him how organize a small business or how can make I know a lot of customers in Nigeria too, but I don't think any big organization like a cooperative union or cooperative societies to help these people. Please, someone answer this question. Thank you.
So the question is about the number of, if you have cooperative organizations training people in the informal sector in Nigeria. Yes, here, sorry. Okay.
Yes, Pauline Baker with the Fund for Peace. I'd like to go back to this unemployment issue a bit and ask you if you have sufficient data to do a regional breakdown. The common perception is that the North has suffered a great deal more and is not part of the sectoral booms that you've been talking about, including in agriculture. And there's a widespread perception that the deindustrialization of the North has led to a lot of the conflict we're seeing there now in the North. I wonder if both you, Volker, and Tony could address this question in terms of inequality being regionally broken down a little bit and get a more clarity on that.
Thank you. I'll take a few more. Yes, sir.
Chia Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. As to the unemployment, is that the data? How many of them have too much money and doesn't need to work? I think money source probably is from oil, money tracked down, and remittance. And could it be channeled to the service industry? And I think one big problem is for the World Bank. Does the World Bank have a plan for the unemployment there? Thank you.
Thank you. So at the back, that woman, yes.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Priscilla Achakpa from Women Environmental Program Nigeria. It's an NGO. I have just some comments and some quick questions. The first question goes to the World Bank, who talked about the employment. And in your presentation, you talked about people actually going back to the rural areas for agricultural, especially the young people. And based on our studies in the field, because we work very much in the field, I'm really surprised that that kind of report is coming up, because the drift from the rural to the urban areas is more on the higher level now, and it's even getting more higher. So to say that the young people are now getting back to the rural areas for agriculture, I mean, it will be interesting to see some kind of statistics. And as a follow-up, the studies on employment, somebody already asked that question. How many regions did it cover? Because Nigeria has about 6 geopolitical zones. How was the studies conducted? And what was the percentage of the responses to this? And as a follow-up, Carl talked about the issues of equality, but also the issue of human rights. As an organization that is working very much in the field with people, we know how much of the human rights, especially when it comes to land, when it comes to issues of housing, that the people are being affected. Now, we know the system of the military, where all lands are vested in the government, and that before you have access to land, you must go through the government. Although the reforms are going on right now, currently, but that reforms are not really decentralized, where people will be able to feed in and say, this is how we want this to happen. And then lastly, my sister Bola, the answer you gave about the health, the population issue, I think to some large extent, the lack of political will by the Nigerian government to engage actively in the issue of population is a huge problem. But also the infrastructure and the healthcare system, especially in the rural areas, is not readily available, and the awareness is not there. So when we talk about the issues of population, in the rural areas, there is nothing, nobody knows about what is going on. Perhaps the concentration in the urban areas needs to be critically reviewed. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I'll take the last question. Yes. Sorry, please. And after that, I'll turn this over you.
Robert Miller, I'm chairman of the Islamic Development Initiative in North America, but my question doesn't relate to the Islamic situation. Is inheritance in the South still matrilineal? You have an odd situation in rural areas where there's a shortage of land. Young men work with their fathers until they reach puberty, then they belong to their mother's family. So the training that takes place earlier in their lives is kind of displaced. Is that still the situation?
Okay. Thank you. I think we've had enough. Now let me allow the panel. So the last question is about inheritance, whether it's patrilineal in the southern part of Nigeria. So how do we want to? We'll probably have to go.
Well, we go in the order that we presented.
In the order, okay. Balito first.
Please, and
okay.
then Volker, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay.
Okay. I would like to respond on the political will of the government to address population issues. I think, yes, you're right. But I think in the last 2-3 years, the government is trying to do something. The last population policy we had in Nigeria was released in 2004. And I did read in the papers recently that the minister was actually talking about government being willing to review that policy now. And then they were like, yes, population is surely an issue that should be looked into. And so I think, though the government is not really there yet, but listening to Chief Ngozi Uwela 2 days ago, I think the government is doing so many things, but the thing is that the government, like she said, and she actually admitted, they are not communicating these to Nigerians. So most Nigerians don't even know what the government is doing. And of course, there's a high level of distrust between the Nigerian people and the government. I mean, anything the government does, an average Nigerian thinks there is an ulterior motive behind it. So I think, yeah, the government is not doing so much, but they said that they want to, or they are in the process of doing something. So I think we just have to wait, keep our fingers crossed, and let's wait for the government to roll out their plans and let us all see what they are up to. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrilineal issue. About the patrilineal, because I can't answer that.
Okay. I think patrilineal or matrilineal in the south. I think in southern part of Nigeria, inheritance is actually mainly patrilineal, as in Nigeria as a whole, really. If it's matrilineal, maybe like a little percentage of the country, but in Nigeria as a whole is definitely patrilineal.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, there was a study done by anthropologists in some southeastern part of Nigeria about matrilineal lineage. Yeah. Okay. So that's the area.
Okay. Okay. Where do I start? The question on the urban rural, of course, as I said before, the last data we had was 2006, and it refers to what we are describing is for the period from 1999 to 2006, really. Now, there are two reasons why we believe this urban-rural situation. Of course, we know there is a lot of flight from the rural areas to the urban areas, particularly Lagos and also Abuja. But why we believe, first of all, it comes out clearly in the data from the General Household Survey and the Nigeria Living Standard Measurement Survey that seems to be the case. But also, this story where actually people returning to the rural areas to a certain extent is also in sync with the macroeconomic situation in Nigeria, right? Because not all growth, the primary contribution to not all growth has been the agricultural sector, right? And of course, we have discussed this at length now, how bad the agriculture sector is doing relative to where it could be going, right? But it's doing a lot better than in 1999, when Nigeria came out of military dictatorship and nothing was done, right? That is the basic story here, right? People, when democracy came, right, lots of remittances, foreign direct investment came back, consumption went up, and much of this consumption, right, given that it is primarily by poorer people, the primary consumption goes to food, and that's expired. So we find there is a correspondence between the macroeconomic story of non-all growth being driven by the agriculture sector and the movement of the population, at least to some extent, to the rural areas. We will have to see by the Nigeria Living Standard Measurement Survey data that are coming out this week, that a work that took 18 months to collect those data. When these data are now being reviewed, whether that is a story that holds also for the most recent 4 or 5 years, or whether there is a modification of that. But given the situation in the urban areas, right, where there isn't really a growth of employment, ultimately, right, and in neither formal employment nor informal employment, it might very well be the case that people continue to benefit from agriculture because that's where growth has occurred. In cassava, in particular, palm oil, previous speakers occurred. We know that agriculture has been growing fast. Now, the question about whether we have regional data, yes, it would in theory be possible to analyze those data in a more regional context. We didn't do that, but I think by and large it is correct that it is the North is much more adversely affected by this than the South or Southwest and the Southeast in particular. There is a major issue. Now, as far as the health situation is concerned, the program that the World Bank has in Nigeria, the reason why health is such a prominent part of the portfolio, right? Like we have a huge malaria booster program, for example, together with the Gates Foundation. I think we are working there, And other HIV/AIDS is a major issue as well. And why this is all the case is precisely not only because there is this interlinkage between health and and economic growth, right? The bank has been recognizing that, and that has been a very important part of our dialogue also with the government. But we are really running into open doors there. I mean, these are things that is not controversial anymore. And the emphasis on health is precisely because it is very crucial also for the economic growth, for the overall welfare of the population. Now, there came this interesting question whether the people were at home because there was too much money. Now, that may, of course, be somewhat provocative, and people may be finding it even offensive in a country where there are so many poor people, but it is not completely off the mark. There is a perception, there is what we call as economists a reservation wage, right, where people actually are willing to go out and work because they feel that they get enough money for that. And one of the reasons when we did the econometric regression for that was we looked at the question of what kind of wage would actually make people go out of the labor force, these 26%, especially among the young people, and start working. And many people are not willing to work for 10,000 naira a month. They want at least 20,000 naira a month. And it is that, so there is an issue of the reservation wage, and that is not critical. I mean, that's just, there is, enough money in for some people in these 26% that are out of the labor force. Not all of them. Many of them would love to work, but they can't. But there is some, for some people in this 26%, there is, that is indeed a consideration, that they are waiting for a better job. They are only willing to work if there is a real formal sector job or something that pays at least 20,000 naira in an informal sector job. So that consideration definitely exists. Now, as far as the World Bank plan for reducing, the World Bank doesn't really have such plans. We are engaging with the government to developing their own plan, right? That's very important because plans that are prepared by the World Bank, that we have gone way beyond that, and we are now, at a stage where we are dialoguing with the government, and we have been dialoguing very intensively with the government on these questions. And the Vision 2020 that you saw was influenced very much by this dialogue. And I think there are enormous opportunities, and I want to speak about this a little bit beyond the generalities, because, I mean, we have been talking about education, about infrastructure, about power, about business environment, about corruption and all these things since, I believe, the World Bank started working in Nigeria, and clearly these issues are all important. But we have to go beyond that. We have to go to specific interventions in sectors that have the highest growth and employment potential. That has been the experience in East Asia and some of the most successful countries. For a country that has such a big problem with capacity of government, like Nigeria has, right, where really both at the state level and the federal level, right, it's so difficult to get things done, right? It's important to focus on those sectors that have the highest growth and employment potential and to support them through active industrial policy measures. Right, and there is a very important trend right now in the world going on that could be major ramifications for Nigeria, and that is the fact that China is really getting out of labor-intensive manufacturing. Right, that's one of the biggest mega trends probably for this century. Right, China is upgrading into higher value-added products. They are getting into sectors that used to be occupied by Latin America, and as they do so, they are looking for places to relocate labor-intensive manufacturing. And the primary place where they're looking for is Africa. That's something that has been supported from the very highest level of China. And we have seen this in Ethiopia, for example. We have already examples of that, where just at the end of last year, a major Chinese manufacturer of shoes has set up a factory for 800 employees. And within 2 weeks, they trained them, and after 2 weeks, they had the same, they had 80% of the productivity of Chinese laborers. That's where Nigeria can really make a difference, right? And that's been our dialogue recently, how we can make that happen, right? That's manufacturing could grow much, much, much faster in some of these special economic zones, Lekki, Tinapa maybe, some of these zones. And that could create manufacturing employment. And manufacturing employment has been crucial to the success of the East Asian countries and of Brazil as well. I completely agree with you, by the way. The similarity between Brazil and Nigeria is really, I completely agree with you. I couldn't, that is really where the country is going. So, these kind of targeting the right sectors that have the highest growth and employment potential by providing related infrastructure and providing related facilitating services for those businesses is going to be crucial. And that could make a real difference to the country and propel growth to a much higher level.
I'll close with just a couple of brief comments because I know we're running out of time. Pauline, I think we all know that the disparity of industrial shrinkage in Nigeria has been acutely felt in the north. I think if the cotton spinning, ginning operations in places like Funtua and Sokoto and the Cotton Belt are largely northern ventures. The Kaduna used to be a large industrial center. It's basically now been vacated. If you go to Kano and you see some of the agro industries and groundnuts and other products, leather has been okay. Skins and hides, that's still a reasonable activity up there. But in those other areas, groundnuts, they've just shrunk. It's very depressing, and I don't think the industrial growth that Volker talks about is likely to happen in the north anytime soon for a bunch of reasons, and we can go on to that at another time because we don't have time for that right now. To my Sudanese friend in the back, one of the things that really amazes me about Nigeria is how committed people are to sort of civic organizations. I mean, it's a very rich culture. People are really devoted and interested in their communities and in their professions and in their business associations, much more so than I think Nigerians get a bad reputation across the board, but that's one area that I think that they is especially misunderstood. And I think that in the areas of entrepreneurship and enterprise and training, there are institutions out there. I think women business leaders are particularly effective in this area. And Professor or Dr. Adesanya, in his presentation just 3 weeks ago, laid out a roadmap of how they're going to enhance extension services and finance in agriculture, which Volker has more, and I both have pointed out as a growth sector. And I would commend you to look at his presentation on the Corporate Council on Africa website. If you navigate that, you'll see on the website his 65-slide presentation, of which one of those slides, slide 21, which I have on my screen here, sketches out a roadmap of extension services in agriculture, which include a whole integrated approach, financing, skill development, small enterprise investment. And I think that you'll find that elsewhere in Nigeria, but I do think it happens, just maybe not as documented as we would like. I could comment on other things, but we're out of time.
Okay. Thank you very much. At this time, I think I would like to say that we've listened to all these presentations and comments, very thoughtful. There are stories of challenges in population, but of hope looking ahead into the future. So as we close this session, I will just invite you to help me thank the presenters for doing a marvelous job and have